Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar on how to develop and roll out smart AI governance strategies in 2025. It's a hot topic amongst many companies and boardrooms, so looking forward to the discussion. Before we get started, I do have a few housekeeping notes to outline for the CLE. For the benefit of all participants, the attendee lines have been muted. So if you do have any questions and you want to submit them throughout the presentation, please submit them through the Q&A box. I'll try to get to them as we're going through the presentation or at the end, or we'll follow up after the program. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be circulated to all registrants via email after the event. If you do have any follow-up questions from that email, please reach out to any of the key contacts in the communication. And please note that Dentons can only issue CLE credit for attendance during the live broadcast of this webinar. Participation on the live webinar must be on a computer or laptop device, and credit isn't available if you're joining by a mobile device. Finally, if you have New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, or Kansas license, please be sure to listen for the code word at some point during the presentation. When prompted, you'll need to enter the code word in the Q&A section of the screen. And if you don't have a license in these states, you can disregard the notice. My name is Peter Stockberger. I am a partner in the San Diego office at Dentons. I'm part of our emerging growth companies practice, and I lead our AI advisory group at the firm. And we work with companies of all sizes, from stealth startups to Fortune 10 companies, on how to navigate the increasingly complex universe of AI governance in today's environment. So for today's webinar, what I wanted to focus on were really three topics. One is I want to give you a sense of where AI is as a technology and where it's developing. I'm going to give you a sense of the state of the law around AI, and then what I see as key tips on building a smart AI governance strategy for any enterprise at any level. To begin with any discussion about AI, I think a core definition is important around AI. Artificial intelligence is a catch-all term that is increasingly being used across enterprises and boardrooms, but it's not well defined. And the one definition that I've sort of clung onto and like, and maybe I'm biased because I'm based in California, is this definition of AI that comes from the California legislature. So there was a new law that California passed and says any legislation about AI in California must use this definition. And the definition is essentially any machine-based system that can vary in its level of autonomy, that for a set of objectives infers from input what output should be generated in order to influence a physical or digital environment. So that is a very broad definition, and some folks even believe that it essentially defines all of software. But I think it's an important starting point to think about the current AI ecosystem that we're all wrestling with today. So AI is this big umbrella term, and within that umbrella term, I think there's two main categories of AI to keep on your radar. The first is what are known as deterministic or rule-based AI systems. And this is what traditional AI has been over the years. This is basic computing rule-based algorithms. So for example, your email spam filter is a form of a rule-based algorithm. If this email contains this name, then put it into the spam filter. And these types of algorithms, this type of artificial intelligence is embedded in a number of common day computing systems. The other category to keep in mind, and this is where most of the activity and risk is today, is on the probability prediction side of the house. These are algorithms that look at data and make predictions about what steps to take next. And within this umbrella term of probabilistic or prediction-based AI is the field of machine learning. Machine learning is essentially the task of training a model, training an algorithm on a data set to then make predictions about patterns or features of that data set. Common machine learning-based tools that are on the market today are Amazon's product recommendation or Netflix recommendation for what movie to watch. These are forms of machine learning that are trained on your data, are making recommendations for behavior coming out of it. Now, within the field of machine learning, there's a deeper field, no pun intended, of deep learning. And deep learning is basically machine learning on steroids. It's taking multiple layers of machine learning and diving deep through what are called neurons or neural networks to more carefully look at the data, pull out more complex relationships by weighing different factors and determining what the output would be. And it's within that field of deep learning that we get generative AI. This is the form of AI that first hit the market in November of 2022 when OpenAI released ChatGPT to the public. And generative AI is a new form of artificial intelligence that is a deep learning model that looks at its training data to generate synthetic text, video, audio, or other multimodal applications. Generative AI, therefore, is new to the area of AI, but it is within this field of probabilistic applications. I want to note, generative AI is not the only form of AI that's in the marketplace. There are other emerging trends that are impacting organizations, but it's important to keep in mind that generative AI, ChatGPT's, Gemini's, the Anthropic's Claude, Meta, Llama, are all falling into that category. Now, generative AI, where does it fall in the spectrum of other AI trends? I think this chart is pretty helpful. It's from a third party called Gartner that evaluates technology trends, and they released what's known as the hype cycle for AI. And this is their chart from 2024. And on the left side of the chart, the way to read it is the innovation trigger. So this is when that technology actually hits the market. And it works up to the peak of inflated expectations and then falls to a trough of disillusionment and then to a plateau of productivity. And you'll see here that Gartner believes that generative AI as a field is on the downslope into the trough of disillusionment because of its inherent limitations. But there are other developments in AI on this chart to keep an eye on: quantum AI, embodied AI, which I'll speak about shortly, multi-agent system AI, sovereign AI. So there's a lot happening in the AI space. Generative AI is just one piece of it, but it happens to be the predominant market conversation going on around AI. So a lot of our organizations are being presented with generative AI tools. Well, it is the dominant AI narrative in the market. It's not the only AI in the market. But what we're finding is that enterprise adoption of generative AI has been mixed. And that's largely because its inherent limitations in its abilities is proving to be difficult to scale within enterprises. We are seeing key market trends around multimodal capability. We're seeing big public policy debates about open source versus closed source and what models provide better reasoning. Ultimately, though, this is all still within the generative AI bucket. There's a lot of competition at the model level, at the infrastructure level. There's a lot of applications hitting the market. But there are some inherent challenges to this field of AI, one of which is what's being seen as an emerging data, energy, and cooling bottleneck. Machine learning is dependent on the data upon which it's trained. And generative AI is a form of deep learning, which is a form of machine learning, is dependent on the data on which it's trained. Therefore, deploying generative AI solutions is highly dependent on good data in and highly qualified and governed classified data being processed. Many organizations don't have great data classification procedures in place. And so the ability to leverage generative AI at scale is hitting a data bottleneck. There's also an energy and cooling bottleneck with regard to the amount of energy and scale it takes for some of these generative AI models, which is presenting a challenge for enterprises looking at whether deploying generative AI runs afoul of their ESG promises. And finally, generative AI's architecture sometimes limits its feasibility because of the inherent risks around reliance and understandability. Many enterprises feel that's too big of a risk to roll it out at scale. But I would say generative AI, or all of AI, we really see three enterprise adoption trends forming. The first one is around general purpose use of AI. And this is really your Microsoft Copilots, your ChatGPTs, your general purpose tools that employees or workforces are using to drive productivity enhancements. And these are often used for brainstorming, et cetera. That's one trend. The other trend is around decision intelligence. This is more advanced deployment of AI to drive better decision-making within an organization. And this is the area where I think we're seeing bigger ROI and bigger value. And the third trend is around agentic workflow automation. This is an emerging trend that is being deployed as a labor resource within organizations. So I'm going to walk through each of these trends because I think they provide an interesting snapshot as to what's happening in the marketplace. The first trend around general purpose, these are your common tools that many employees are using. And a survey by Microsoft and LinkedIn in 2024, where they surveyed 31,000 workers across 31 countries, found that 75% are using AI on a daily basis as part of their work. And a majority of those individuals are not reporting it up to the chain of command, in part because they fear that it will be shut down, or they fear that it will be viewed as cheating or somehow taking a shortcut. And this use, it crosses generations. These use cases are probably some that you're already using today, which is brainstorming, code generation, image generation, general use cases. I think the risk for this type of enterprise adoption is fairly clear at this point. Loss of confidentiality, loss of trade secrets if you're putting something into these tools that you shouldn't be putting in, privacy and security risk. And I think the guardrails to prevent against that risk are becoming more clear. It really comes down to your acceptable use guidelines, your acceptable use policy. What have you told employees they can or cannot use these general purpose tools for? And what are your technical guardrails around those tools? And then how are you training folks to use these tools? I think that combination of an acceptable use policy plus really active and targeted training is critical to maximize the benefit of general purpose tools and mitigate the risk. But this is a very common low-hanging fruit use case within organizations that can be addressed today with good policy and good training. The second enterprise trend that I think is very interesting, and one that is more complex and is driving higher value, is decision intelligence. And this is the process of taking a combination of AI tools, whether it be generative AI in a large language model for the user interface, a more proprietary form of deep learning or machine learning on the back end, and perhaps multiple systems feeding in data and intelligence together to help augment very specific decision-making capabilities within the organization. Gartner estimates that by 2026, 75% of global top 500 companies will have some type of decision intelligence capabilities. And we see this practice, this is beyond just general purpose, this is very targeted, and we see it in use cases across driving customer insights, marketing. In the manufacturing space, we see digital twin creation really taking off, robotic surgery and clinical care in the healthcare space, making decisions on claims in the insurance space. And in the utility space, we see it being used to maximize grid usage, minimize equipment repair needs. So decision intelligence, which is a large umbrella, and it looks different for every organization, is really, I think, on the upswing for enterprises. And it's a combination of AI tools. It's not just one size fits all that's proving to be an effective solution. The third trend that I think is very interesting at the moment is agentic workflow automation. Many of you may have heard the term AI agents, agentic AI. It seems to be the buzzword of 2025, as it relates to AI. And what this refers to is a set of AI systems that can be given an objective, a goal, given access to tools to achieve that goal, and then set free to go out and complete that objective. So these are autonomous systems that are empowered to make decisions, take action, engage with a customer, take a phone call, process a payment, review a database, take action on the actual goals. And we're seeing a significant industry trend by a lot of the large players in the AI space on deploying these agentic AI solutions. For example, Salesforce, at their major conference last year, Dreamforce, released Agentforce, which is their ability for Salesforce customers to create and deploy their own customizable agents. We see other big players jumping in as well. And what's a growing problem in this deployment of AI agents is orchestration and interoperability. So we see a lot of movement there as well, with organizations like Microsoft and OpenAI announcing orchestration platforms, the ability to control multiple agents at once. The applications in this space are still developing, but they are growing at a rapid pace. So many organizations, if you aren't already looking at agentic workflow solutions, you may be looking at them in the future. This gives you a sense of what the architecture looks like for an agentic workflow, and it's fairly basic, but this is a singular agent. And you can imagine you ask the agent a question. I want to return an air fryer through a chat. The agent then takes in your input, it breaks it down through a planning tool on what tasks it needs to take forward and communicate. It then accesses its memory, all the data it's been trained on, plans out its action, communicates with the customer, and then actually goes and executes the return by accessing the CRM database or the sales database or that customer's history. That's a singular agent architecture flow. Now imagine 1,000 of those agents operating within an organization all at once. That is the promised future of agentic AI. And this causes a lot of organizations concern from a legal and compliance perspective. I think one of the biggest risks with this new trend of agentic workflow automation is increased autonomy. Who is in control of the agent who is performing the task? Who will be ultimately responsible for what the agent does? What's the liability regime going to be around that? And right now, the law is unsettled in this area. The other important risk area around agentic AI to keep your eye on is many of these tools, as you're deploying them, in order for them to access databases, information, they do so through API access. API access is a very common nomenclature in the world of software. It's how software interacts with each other, and these agents are going to be accessing software to perform tasks. Many software companies are now building APIs that are specific to non-human identities accessing those API connections. You can imagine, though, this introduces significant security risk. And there are a number of security risk guidelines being issued about agentic deployment. Finally, one of the biggest risks around agentic workflow automation deployment is the issue of these tools are still based on generative AI, which is still a form of machine learning, which means they are inherently subject to accuracy and reliability issues. There was an article that just came out from the Wall Street Journal that says AI agents are everywhere and nowhere at once. And it's highlighting the concern that organizations have about agentic AI solutions because they are LLM or generative AI based, and therefore they may not have the agency that we want them to have. So this is another, I think, interesting visual that Gartner provided about this issue of agency. When you talk about an AI agent going out to perform a task, it may be autonomous in that it can go off on its own, but does it have agency to make the decision? Does it have authority? And Gartner noted that low-level deterministic chatbots, the script-based chatbots that we engage with on a daily basis, they have very low agency, if zero agency. LLM-based assistants, these generative AI-based agents, are moving toward a higher agency, but they're still quite limited. And between human beings and generative AI-powered agents, we have an agency gap. So what is going to fill that gap? And I think one trend to keep on your radar that may fill that gap is something called embodied AI. This is an emerging trend in the AI space that I think will significantly impact all of us in the coming years. And this is a type of AI that isn't just trained on data and making predictions based on ones and zeros, but it actually understands the physical world. It understands what an apple is or what a table is, and it can make judgments in real time at the edge without relying on historic data. And there are some significant players in this space. The head of Stanford AI Institute, Fei Li, who is often referred to as the godmother of AI and a significant thinker in this space, recently built a new startup around spatial intelligence, about training AI about the physical world and understanding how to interact with the physical world. There's a lot of promise in embodied AI to revolutionize manufacturing and surgical applications. One of the challenges with embodied AI, so this physical AI, with digital AI, which is what we are all interacting with today, is how do you connect it all? How do you ensure it's all speaking the same language and we have appropriate controls? And this is really future looking to where policy may be heading. At the international level, the IEEE, they are building and are getting ready to deploy this year what's known as the Spatial Web Protocol. This is essentially the internet for all of AI, both physical and digital. And so when you think about the internet today, if you build a website, you need to write it in a certain language, HTML. In order to ensure that other websites can read your website, you need to transmit information over a protocol, HTTP. Well, what the Spatial Web Protocol is, it's the internet for all of everything, which is hyperspatial modeling language for the communication language, and the hyperspatial transaction protocol for the method of transmission. So this is happening at the global level. And if you would like to learn more about it, we do have a white paper about the Spatial Web Protocol and what it will mean for the future of AI. But I think those are important trends to keep in mind because we have generative AI dominating the landscape today. We have agentic AI workflow automation emerging, and we have embodied AI on the horizon. So the development in this space is rapidly advancing. So what does that mean from a legal perspective? If you are a compliance officer, a chief legal officer, what does it mean for your organization as the technology is moving so fast? And I think in the legal space, we'll think about the legal space first. I do want to pause here and let you know this is the code word. So this is for folks who have a license in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, or Kansas. The code word here is AI law. You just need to take a brief moment and type that into the Q&A screen and make sure you hit the send so it registers. And in case you missed it for the first time, the code word is AI law. We'll give folks a moment to pop that in. All right, so now that we've got the landscape of AI under our belt, I think it's now critical to look at what the legal landscape looks like. And I want to first start with the global picture. At the global level, there is a consensus amongst nations that there should be some way to guardrail and steer the development and deployment of AI. The challenge is the pathway forward is not so clear. And we are starting to see deep divisions between national players on this topic. Recently, at the Paris AI Summit, US Vice President J.D. Vance gave a speech where he outlined the US's approach, which was minimal regulation, maximum innovation, win the competition race. In Europe, there's a different approach in terms of regulation. And we really see three approaches shaping the global landscape. The first is a risk-based approach to regulating AI. And this is what we see with the EU AI Act, the first of its kind international AI law that fully takes effect next year, but has some components in effect today. South Korea recently passed what's known as the Basic AI Act, also a risk-based model. El Salvador actually surprisingly is moving forward with a risk-based model. And we have in the US laws like the Colorado AI Act that is a risk-based model. So this is basically saying we're not going to regulate it at the model level, we're going to regulate it at the deployment level. And depending on how high risk the use case is, we will impose certain restrictions. So for example, if you're going to be using AI in a way that makes decisions about somebody's personal life, like employment or insurance or healthcare, we're going to ensure that you have robust governance and protection measures in place. If it's very high risk, it may be prohibited. If it's low risk, it may be permitted with very little guidance. That's one approach. The second approach is more lighter touch. And this is the approach that Japan is pursuing, which is promoting innovation, promoting research and development, encouraging industry-level regulation to develop. This could be the bucket that the US follows from a national policy perspective. but we'll have to see. And central management is the third bucket, which is really how China is currently managing AI regulation from the top down, which is not surprising for China. Now, that's the global landscape. And the EU AI Act and the South Korea AI Act are complicated laws that could be webinars in and of themselves. But it's important to understand that global picture as we look at what's happening on a US basis. And in the US, at the federal level, it's quite a mixed picture currently. The previous administration, President Biden, had issued an executive order on AI in October of 2023, directing the federal government and all agencies to deploy various AI strategies, to appoint AI officers, to deploy AI responsibly. And that executive order had a lot of knock-on effects in different industries in regulatory development. President Trump has rescinded that executive order and issued one of his own focused solely on AI innovation and driving the US competitive landscape. Now, there are still some executive orders lingering around, for example, the one on export controls on advanced computing chips and model weights. But I think what we're going to see at the federal level is less regulatory oversight. I think that's pretty clear at this point from the FTC, potentially others like the EEOC, the Department of Justice with regard to corporate compliance programs. We'll have to wait and see how it impacts agencies that are really focused on this area like HHS and its impact on FDA guidance and some rules that are already in the marketplace. And from a legislative perspective, I'm not holding my breath for a federal AI law. I think we may see bits and pieces of AI legislation that address specific high-risk areas like the use of minor data, or perhaps use of it in healthcare or fintech, or if there's an incident, some other type of legislative approach. But for now, the robust policy proposals, I think probably will take a back seat. Now, what we see at the state level is we see a lot more activity. And so I'm going to move through from a categorical level what the states are doing in this space. The first category is around chatbots. Each US state has an unfair business practice law that generally says you can't engage in unfair or deceptive business practices. Recently, the attorneys general of California and Oregon in December and January, respectively, issued guidance stating that we don't need a new AI law on the books to hold companies accountable for misuse of AI. We will leverage our existing unfair competition laws, consumer protection laws, and privacy laws to hold companies accountable. And specifically, they've called out the use of chatbots. And their bottom line recommendation to companies is don't mislead the public, don't say things that are false, and don't misrepresent your identity as a human being when you're really not a human being. And they seem like basic guardrails, but as these chatbots get more advanced, especially with the introduction of agentic AI, ensuring accuracy, reliability, and transparency can become a more difficult task. California was actually first on the scene in this space in 2019 with an AI bot law that says if you are going to be engaging with a California resident online through a web service and you're going to be using a chat function and it's a bot, it's automated, you need to tell the person that it's automated. And so that's why you often see a little icon with a robot or something that says this is an automated chat. Utah passed a law that took effect last year that says if you're using generative AI in your chat feature and the Utah resident asks you, is this generative AI? You have to answer yes in the affirmative. Now, that's very difficult to code into chatbots. So what a lot of organizations are doing is they're placing that disclaimer at the top of the chat. This chat may involve the use of generative AI. And I think we're seeing a rise in litigation in this space, especially as plaintiffs' lawyers are leveraging decades-old laws relating to electronic eavesdropping to allege that the use of a third-party chat provider, whether it's AI-powered or not, is eavesdropping on a communication between two parties. So lots moving in the chatbot space from a legal perspective. and we'll probably continue to see more guidance in this space. Another area where we see activity is around high-risk systems. So getting back to that global picture, the global buckets of AI law, the risk-based system approach, we are seeing it crop up in the US as well. In California, the California Privacy Protection Agency, which is the privacy agency charged with enforcing the California Consumer Privacy Act, is considering regulations at the moment around what are known as automated decision-making technologies, or ADMTs. And what the CPPA is saying is that if you use an ADMT in a high-risk use case, making an employment decision, a healthcare decision, an insurance decision, and there's a number of others, you need to provide robust notice to California residents, explaining before you deploy this system what the underlying logic of the system is, what parameters are used to create the outputs, and how you, as the business, would be subject to those outputs and use them. So if you're subject to the CCPA, this is an important space to watch. These regulations are only in draft form. They are being considered. They're open for public comment, and we'll have to see if they get adopted in their current form. I will note that there's a lot of debate happening right now at both the regulatory level at the agency, as well as coming out of the California legislature, arguing that these regulations go too far and overstep certain boundaries. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Another important law to have on your radar is the Colorado AI Act. This is a new law that Colorado passed last year that takes effect in February of 2026 and applies to any developers or deployers of high-risk AI systems. Again, that category of high risk is again articulated in the law: employment, healthcare, insurance, and the like. And if you are subject to these laws, if you're subject to the Colorado law in particular, you need to conduct robust risk assessments, mitigation of discriminatory outcomes, validation of certain information with the vendor. So it's very much a first of its kind law, a mini EU AI Act in the US. And Virginia recently passed a similar law out of their legislature, which is pending the governor's signature. And perhaps even as I'm speaking now, the governor has signed it or indicated whether they're going to sign it. But I think this is a trend we are seeing, and it's perhaps a trend that may follow in the footsteps of data privacy legislation, in which we would have a patchwork across the 50 states. I think one notable aspect of the Virginia law is there's some mention of baselining yourself to the NIST risk management framework for AI as a baseline, perhaps as a safe harbor. So will other states follow there? Remains to be seen. On that data privacy front, we have multiple states with robust data privacy laws that can impact the use and deployment of AI, from notice at collection to how you process it, to what rights people have, to opt-outs around sale and processing of sensitive data. As I mentioned earlier, the eavesdropping laws that are being leveraged by the plaintiffs' bar in litigation is complicating this space, especially as it relates to the deployment of agentic AI solutions. So for example, if you have a vendor that can answer telephone calls for you, which is a hot use case in the agentic space, and you are not disclosing to the consumer upfront who that third party is, could you get sued by the plaintiffs' bar for eavesdropping? That's an open question. And the California Attorney General, in their guidance that they issued in January, specifically called out that use case as a potential risk. And then finally, on the privacy side, those California ADMT regulations, very important to keep on your radar. Now, another area where we see AI developments is in the insurance space. The NAIC has issued a model bulletin about minimizing the risk of using AI in a way that could result in discriminatory outcomes. We have similar guidance issued by New York regulators and California regulators. Colorado has had a law on the books since 2021 that protects against unfair discriminatory outcomes. And we're starting to see litigation in this space as well. Insurance is a hot area for risk, in part because it's listed as one of the high-risk systems under laws like the Colorado AI Act. And there is a high risk of discriminatory outcomes by deploying models to make decisions about claims processing and denials. So this is a vertical, a space, insurance, where there's high focus by the regulators, and we probably can expect to see more regulation from the states in this space. Similarly, another highly regulated area is employment. There are a number of states with active AI laws relating to the deployment of AI tools for making decisions in the employment or in the hiring space. So Illinois actually was first to the market here. They've had a law on the books since 2020 that says if you're going to use AI in a job interview, you need to tell the interviewee that the AI is being used and that they need to consent to that. And they've updated that law with one that takes effect next year that mitigates discriminatory outcomes in the hiring or employment decision-making process. California is also looking at updating their anti-discrimination laws to include requirements around deployment of AI. New York City has a law that's been on the books since 2023 that requires covered entities to mitigate discriminatory outcomes in using AI to make a decision in the employment space. Colorado's AI applies here, and Maryland has had a law on the books since 2020. This space, employment, insurance, and what I'll mention is healthcare, are highly focused spaces for regulators in the plaintiffs' bar. These are high-risk areas of deployment within an organization. And these tools are more commonly being deployed by your HR vendors, whether it's scanning resumes for a job applicant or looking at performance reviews or giving coaching to sales teams. AI tools are pretty prolific in the HR space. So if there's any key takeaway from this conversation, it's make sure that your HR team is communicating with your legal and risk team to understand what tools are being considered, how they're being deployed, and how you can mitigate the risk in that space. Speaking of a highly regulated space, healthcare is certainly top of mind. And you can imagine all of the various use cases in healthcare that can be triggered here, both on the operations side as well as on the clinical care delivery side. California, for example, has a law that impacts disclaimers for patients. Virginia has a law about disclaimers for patients. Georgia has a law about risk assessments and disclaimers. So I won't dive too deep on healthcare. We, in fact, have an AI webinar on healthcare coming up on March 26th, if you're interested, where we'll dive much deeper on all things related to AI and healthcare. But again, it shows you from a 10,000-foot level that in various industries, we have significant focus by the regulators, by the legislators, and by the plaintiffs' bar at a categorical level. And I think we're going to continue to see that where there's a lack of federal guidance and federal legislation. Finally, the last bucket I wanted to raise for you are things around image likeness and political advertising. There are a number of states that have passed laws that regulate how you can use someone's likeness, prohibit deep fakes for using celebrities without their permission. Several states with laws regulating the generation of ad content in political campaigns or deep fakes generating political identities. So a lot moving in this space, but this is a category that the state regulators and the legislatures are particularly interested in at the moment. So that's the general sort of legal landscape from a regulation standpoint. I did also want to raise this issue of litigation. And litigation, I think, is an emerging battleground in the AI space that organizations need to pay attention to from a risk mitigation standpoint. The first is around copyright. There are dozens of lawsuits pending in federal court at the moment by various artists and celebrities and newspaper organizations and media companies alleging that the generative AI model companies trained their models on copywritten material without permission. And the legal debate happening in those spaces is whether the use of copywritten material is fair use. And there are a number of defenses going on, a number of high-profile cases to track. But I think this is an important space to watch, because if a federal court rules that one of these AI companies violated federal copyright law, and companies are relying on that model to build out their marketing collateral or other communications, you can see where the ripple effect may come into play. Another area where there's high focus is around ESG. Now, a lot of organizations make statements about their environmental in social and governance policies, that they're going to be carbon neutral, or they're presenting certain claims about their environmental practices. Generative AI uses a lot of data, uses a lot of energy, requires a lot of cooling, requires a lot of water. And there's public reporting about its impact on farming communities and carbon footprint of data centers. So I think organizations should take a hard look at whether their deployment of generative AI solutions or any AI solution runs up against or creates challenges to ESG statements more broadly. Another area where we're starting to see litigation occurring is in the consumer protection and privacy space. Privacy litigants arguing that the use of these third-party tools is eavesdropping, and there's some other combination claims arising. Bad faith in the insurance space. We see some lawsuits pending there, alleging that the denial of claims using AI was bad faith. And we see litigation in the employment space. There's some active litigation actually occurring in the Northern District of California against a very large HR software provider, alleging that the deployment of that job applicant scanning tool violates Title VII of the Civil Rights Act because it wasn't trained on a diverse enough data set. And therefore, it was resulting in recommendations for job applicants in a discriminatory fashion. So that case is proceeding, very interesting space to watch. But the litigation area, I think, is an emerging battleground in analyzing AI risk more broadly. So that hopefully gives you a sense of where the technology is heading, where it is in the marketplace, and ultimately where the legal landscape in the US sits as it relates to AI. I want to now shift to what is really the meat of this presentation, and that is, how do you put this all together as an organization? How do you build a governance program that can take into account the fast-moving technological space, that can take into account the fast-moving legal space and the opportunities that are presented to all of your organizations? And I think a starting point in thinking about smart AI governance is understanding where the pain points are. So if you understand where the pain points are, it's easier to build a compliance and governance program that's workable for the organization. And I would say I am seeing three main pain points arise in the clients that we work with. One is keeping track of the pace of innovation. Folks are struggling with building a governance program that is nimble enough and is flexible enough to take into account general purpose applications, decision intelligence deployments, agentic workflow automation. They've either built the program too rigid around generative AI use cases like Copilot, or they don't have a program because it's hard to keep up with the technological advances. That's one pain point that we're seeing. Another pain point is around decision-making bottlenecking. Now, a lot of organizations have set up an AI governance committee, an AI governance council, a group that is dedicated to reviewing AI use cases and making judgment calls as to whether this is high risk, medium risk, low risk, and what guardrails do we put in place. What we are seeing and hearing from our clients is AI decision-making bottlenecking. And what's occurring is one of two things. The first is that folks on the ground who are charged with putting in guardrails, your legal team, your privacy team, your IP team, your technical team, they are being asked to make strategic decisions. Is this the type of AI we should be deploying? Is it ethical? Does it align with our mission and our values? Does it move the needle? Does it add value? Those are decisions that are often should be made by a more strategic group, then leaving the operational decisions to the operations group. So that bottlenecking is a big challenge, and the unclear regulatory and legal picture is presenting a significant challenge. This snapshot actually comes from one of our surveys that our global AI team did across companies globally, and they found that a significant majority portion of companies surveyed found that the unclear regulatory picture is presenting a challenge. So how do you address these pain points? I think the starting point is you have to ask, well, what is this concept of being responsible? Regulators, industry, whether it's state, federal, trade groups, everyone is talking about implementing a responsible AI governance framework. And as a lawyer, my first question is, what does that mean? What is responsible? It's like determining what reasonable means. And what we've seen is that responsible is aligning yourself to certain principles-based approaches to developing and deploying AI. And so on the right side of your screen is a combination of these principles, but each principle-based framework frames it slightly differently. And you have multiple organizations that have released responsibility principles. You have the OECD, NIST has principles, ISO has principles. So you can pick and choose the principles that most align with your organization. But these should generally benchmark your approach to deployment of AI. It's not a checklist, but instead it's a prism through which to view each use case and determine, is this high risk, is this low risk, is this high value, is this low value? And the way I like to think about the responsibility framework and governance is brakes on a race car. In times past, when cars did not have brakes on them, they were limited in how fast they could go because of the safety issues. But when you put guardrails, when you put protections in place, it allows you to accelerate faster. And good AI governance, effective AI governance, smart AI governance allows you to move quicker in your AI adoption journey. Bad AI governance is resulting in bottlenecking. So the goal is, let's get smart on this new process that many organizations are wrestling with for the first time. So this just gives you a snapshot. There are many frameworks to choose from. They have common principles across the frameworks. I would say from a US perspective, we're starting to see more organizations benchmark their approach of AI governance to the NIST AI risk management framework that was released by the National Institute for Standards and Technology as a baseline to say, this is our programmatic approach to mitigating AI risk. In addition to those principles-based frameworks, we have a lot of technical standards that are being issued by groups like ISO and the IEEE. So you can combine this principles-based approach with very technical architecture-based approaches to reviewing models, to reviewing use cases. So whereas about a year ago or 2 years ago, when ChatGPT was first hitting the market, everyone was scrambling to figure out, where do we anchor ourselves? Today, there's a lot to anchor to. So I think we're in a much different picture than we were several years ago. So what does this mean? How do you put together smart AI governance? I think one of the first things you need to do is figure out what you're benchmarking to, taking those standards, taking those principles, and asking yourself, if we were in front of a court, if we were in front of a regulator, if we had to answer a vendor questionnaire or answer our board of directors, what are we anchored to? What is our North Star from a governance perspective? And I do believe from a US perspective, the NIST AI risk management framework will likely start to become more of an industry standard. And the reason why I say that is because that's what happened in the cybersecurity space. In 2014, NIST issued a cybersecurity framework. And this framework was initially intended to apply to the federal government and give guidance about good general cybersecurity practices. But eventually, private industry started to adopt the NIST framework as a baseline for engaging in reasonable cybersecurity. Many states today have laws on the books that say you need to have reasonable cybersecurity, and they benchmark themselves to the NIST cybersecurity framework. So I think if you're looking for an anchor in the US market, NIST could be that anchor. Now, I will say the NIST risk management framework is not a checklist of activities. It instead gives you a framework by which you can develop your own policies and your own strategy to mitigate AI risk. So it talks about strategic governance at the top level. It talks about policy development. It talks about risk management and governing through culture and training. I think it's also important to integrate all of those different laws and the compliance issues into your risk management framework. So benchmarking your approach, anchoring it to an existing framework, critically important in this space today. The second thing that I think organizations who are doing it right are allocating appropriate strategic and decision-making authority to avoid that bottleneck. Who is responsible for reviewing AI use cases? Do you want the management committee to be reviewing every single case that comes in, or do you want them to issue strategic goals and alignment and go forward with AI subcommittee and look at all use cases through that alignment? Now, there's challenges with that approach as well. You have to constantly be evolving your strategic vision in order to not be stale and create bottlenecks at the lower level. But effective bifurcation of that decision-making, I think, is an effective strategy in building smart AI governance today. And it also leverages folks' strengths. So you don't have somebody who's a privacy lawyer reviewing strategic questions. You have multi-stakeholders at the table, from security to legal to privacy to marketing, but they have a lane in which they're viewing each use case. And I think that has proven to be a successful model for many organizations. Now, there still is bottlenecking occurring, but the goal is to minimize that bottlenecking. I think one area that is a real hotbed right now for AI governance programs is contracting. This is where the rubber meets the road for most organizations as it relates to mitigating your risk in deploying AI. And we're starting to see more companies and vendors start to put in place AI riders or AI attachments similar to data processing addendums. We're seeing battle lines drawn in the reps and warranties section. For example, many contracts have inside with a vendor or SaaS provider, we disclaim any representation or warranty around accuracy or reliability. The buyers of those systems are asking, I need more representation on accuracy and reliability. How accurate is your model? So there's some tensions there that various organizations are thinking through. Liability shifting is a big battle mark right now. Who is responsible for the output and who is responsible for the ultimate use? Going back to one of the laws that I mentioned, the Utah AI law, it affirmatively says that a deployer of a generative AI system cannot blame the AI for saying something incorrect or deceptive. So how do you shift that liability in the contract space? I think data ownership is something that all of us have been thinking about for quite some time. Who owns the inputs? Who owns the outputs? Who can license the data coming in and training? I think how you baseline reasonableness, how are you establishing reasonableness with your vendors and with your buyers? And I think force majeure is a hidden risk that folks need to pay attention to. Most force majeure clauses exclude acts of government or acts of war. And in the cybersecurity space, we have seen disputes arise when there is an act by a nation state, be it North Korea or Russia, in the cybersecurity space, and then there's a dispute over whether that was an act of government. I think as we get into more agentic or embodied AI solutions that present more physical and digital risk, and we see cybersecurity attacks in those spaces, it's important to question whether you need some exclusions in your force majeure provisions. Another area for smart AI governance today is about vendor diligence, and this really works on both sides of the house. If you're a vendor in the AI space, you need to be ready to answer these questions. If you're a buyer of AI, you need to be asking these questions. And I think we are past the point where surface level questions about AI and models is going to pass muster from a legal perspective. I think you have to dig deep and understand what model's being provided. Is it open source? Is it closed source? What are the transparency obligations? What are the regulatory triggers? What's the viability and explainability? How does it impact ESG? And you need to be asking those questions, usually through the form of a questionnaire. Now, I'm a big fan of not recreating the wheel. So a lot of organizations we work with are leveraging their existing cybersecurity and privacy questionnaires to add AI questions. But equally important in this process is who's going to be reviewing that information back and how does it get analyzed? And this gets back to the bifurcated decision-making strategy. You may determine that this type of vendor presents high value. Let's move forward. You send out the questionnaire. Now you've got stakeholders across security, privacy, legal, risk, HR, who would then be reviewing these use cases and determining whether the vendor's questionnaires are adequate or not. And on the vendor side, I think you're also going to be seeing more and more questions. So having that story to tell publicly about your responsible AI governance journey, I think is equally important. And finally, a final component that I think is critically important in the AI space is around AI literacy. AI literacy at its core is training, is understanding and working with teams to look at how AI can be used, what is it, how to prompt effectively, What are the acceptable uses for general purpose tools? What are the acceptable uses for decision intelligence? Are those two use cases separate? And I think this helps in two ways. One, it helps mitigate risk generally, similar to cybersecurity and privacy and all the other topics you need to train on. It educates the workforce. And I think an educated workforce is an empowered one. It also can help blunt some of the anxiety that's happening at the employee level. There's a lot happening in AI. There's a lot of headlines saying, is this going to replace jobs? And so empowering people with education about what is being used and what is not being used and where we are heading and what's our strategic vision, I think goes a long way in many organizations. I think the legal requirement is also something to keep in mind. If you are an organization subject to the EU AI Act, you need to be engaging in AI literacy because that is actually today a current legal requirement that's in effect under the EU AI Act is to engage in AI literacy. And finally, again, I don't think you need to recreate the wheel here. I think you can take a page from cybersecurity training. In my view, some of the most effective training is training that is ongoing, iterative, role-based, and hyper-specific to different departments. You know, the training on AI for marketing really shouldn't be the same as training on AI for employment and vice versa. So I think leveraging existing practices is critically important. So with a few minutes left, I did want to answer some common questions around smart AI governance, these questions that are coming in. And one of them is, how do you address the proliferation of AI recording tools that we're seeing amongst organizations and teams? And these are, for example, when you log into a Microsoft Teams meeting or a Zoom meeting like this, you see a third-party AI recorder, whether it be Otter AI or Read AI. There's a lot out there that users can download and then plug in to their instance. And I would say organizations are treating those differently. Some are having a complete ban and therefore educating their employees to not permit those tools to be used. Others are taking a more wait and see approach and only deploying enterprise grade recording tools. But another question about that is, how do we manage the retention of those transcripts? And this gets to a broader issue of data governance and data retention. I think a lot of organizations are struggling with, as you have more transcripts, as you have more AI generating inputs and outputs, how do you properly manage that information flow? And I think the key answer is you've got to get down to data classification. You've got to get down to data retention and management. And it ultimately is a question of how long you think you need to be retaining those records for. Another question that came in is, how do you manage the bottlenecking of the decision-making when the strategic vision is not clear? And I think if you are in an environment where you don't quite have the strategic vision, now is the time to have that conversation at both the C-suite level and the board level. Because where we are in the AI journey at this point is we are, I think, in the flip phone stage of the smartphone evolution. Generative AI and the AI that's on the market today is very powerful, is very useful, and is being deployed at scale. But the AI that's coming is even more advanced. And so if you don't yet have a market strategic vision for how you view AI as a technology and where you want to be in the marketplace, it can become very difficult down the line to effectually carry out some of the decision making. And I'll just leave you with this practical example. I had one organization that I was talking to, and they said a big concern of ours is teams are going to be submitting requests for AI tools and approval, and coming back, it takes too long to get a result. So the CTO is frustrated and the marketing team's frustrated, and they created a ticketing system where they said, you submit your ticket and we will review your use case and come back with you with a red light, green light, or yellow light with guardrails within 1 week. And that sort of sped up the process and it built trust. I think if I'm going to leave you with anything as a key takeaway, this entire process is about building trust. Trust in your organization, that you're deploying AI responsibly, to trust with the regulators, that you're not overstepping your bounds, trust with your partners, your clients, your customers, your vendors, that everyone is speaking the same language, and ultimately trust in the marketplace. So you all can increase your market share and drive value to the organization. So with that, our time is up. Thank you very much for spending an hour with us to learn all things about AI. In approximately 30 business days, you all will receive an email with a link to your CLE certificate, your webinar login details. You can use those to process your certifications. No additional steps are required. And once again, a reminder, the code word requirement earlier, AI laws only if you're seeking credit in Kansas, New York, New Jersey, or Pennsylvania. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time and have a terrific day.